Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to this special edition of Fronteras, A Changing America. Today, we'll be opening up the show to audience questions for our guest, John Valadez. He's the producer of the PBS documentary series, Latino Americans. Here's a preview.
It's a mighty long road that my poor hands have hoed. My poor feet have traveled a long, dusty road. At the edge of your cities, you will see us, and then we come with the dust, and we're gone with the wind.
We say you cannot close your eyes and your ears to us any longer, because we are here. And we are not alone.
We are not here to threaten or to beg. We are here to participate.
Most people are saying the Spanish, the Mexicans, indigenous peoples do not have the special inheritance of liberty that we have. We have to move them out.
They're being pushed off their land.
Lynching is commonplace.
They were intended to send a message to Latinos about their place in American society.
My father thought that the United States would be like paradise. There was jobs for everyone, and there were thousands of people trying to get across.
Truman puts the medal around Macario's neck. Here's a man who's shed his blood, and yet he can't get something to eat.
I hate them using Spanish all the time. You can't get them to speak English.
Every time we sit at that table to have something to eat, someone was exploited, and we're going to change it.
I believe in the idea of amnesty.
Reagan said, an illegal alien is just a willing worker.
It was a risk. It was a gamble. It's a gamble that had to be taken. We're trying to make schools better, trying to make the country better.
No person has failed to feel the hand of Willie Velasquez.
These were Americans, patriotic Americans.
Reckless? Yes. Dangerous? Extremely. Did it pay off? Damn right.
The first European language spoken in what would become the United States, Spanish.
The people who just arrived see the people who have been here as outsiders.
I left 51.5 years ago, and I've replayed that day over in my memory.
Immigration means it all gets to be part of your identity.
I can't believe it!
There's so much at stake for all Americans in how Latinos in the United States do.
I see it as this quilt with all these different colored threads weaving this common story.
I am so proud to be your mayor.
Thank you.
It's crucial that we know who we are, where we come from. That's important for generations to come.
So what you just saw was a collage of 3 episodes from the documentary Latino Americans. Now, I'd like to introduce the producer of that series, John Valadez. Welcome, John.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Sure. Now, before I open the floor up to questions from the audience, I have a few questions myself. So I wonder where the idea for this series was born, and has anything like it been done before?
Boy, you know, I think for all of us who worked on the series, it's something that we have longed for and dreamed of and hoped for a long time. And there have been many attempts to try to do a series just like this. You have to remember, American broadcast television began in 1939. So it's taken 74 years for a series like this that would tell the story of Latinos in the United States and the role that we play in that grand American narrative to come to national television. So I think we're at a landmark moment in television history and a landmark moment, I think, for the country.
And so why did it take 74 years, and what was the impetus that led to this, to decide now is the time, we're going to do this now?
Well, I think it took 74 years because people weren't interested, right? Not NBC, not ABC, not CBS, not CNN, not Fox, right? And for most of our history, you have to remember that Mexican Americans, who may be, right, American citizens, were looked on by the broader American society as Mexicans, as somehow foreign, as somehow not American, as somehow not belonging to this country, to this land, and not contributing significantly to our history and to the national character of our country. And I think it's taken this long for the country to finally, come around, and it's painful to, have to reflect upon all of that absence. But I think, on the other hand, we're at the dawning of a new day, and I think this series can really help span divides of difference and find new connections for positive change and understanding as we move into the 21st century.
Was it a challenge to research the series and find the information that you end up presenting?
Well, actually, one of the shows that I did for the series was about the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. And one of the things that I learned that I had no idea about was that, remember that in the 1960s in Los Angeles, as well as in Texas and in 10 states, western states, Mexican American students walked out of their schools and they demanded that they get the same quality education as other Americans. They demanded that Mexican American teachers and administrators be hired. And they demanded that Mexican American participation in American history be added to the curriculum. So one of the things that happened in the ensuing years was the establishment of Mexican American studies, ethnic studies, Latino studies, programs across this country. So today, there are Latino, Mexican American, Chicano studies programs at over 160 colleges and universities. Now, it's those professors, those scholars at those colleges who then went back and wrote the books, wrote the history, excavated the past and brought it back to life and rescued it from the dustbin so that it could be incorporated in the broader American narrative. And so, in some sense, you could say it was the Chicano civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s that actually made this entire series possible.
Wow. So now, in the first episode, we go as far back as 2 centuries, right? When this part of the country, the Southwest, was still a part of Mexico, and you explore how this part of the country reacted to the first Anglo settlers, right? And including New Mexico, and New Mexico kind of stands out among the rest of the Southwest. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, how and why New Mexico stands out.
Yeah, well, New Mexico is very unique. Okay, you have to remember that there was the U.S.-Mexico War, which ended in 1848, and when that war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, okay, those Mexicans who were living in the northern half of Mexico, which was Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, parts of Utah, Colorado, right, they were to become American citizens with all the rights and responsibilities that go along with it. But very quickly, especially in Texas and California, they were dispossessed from their land. They were swindled, they were driven off, they were lynched, and they lost, they lost everything. Now, New Mexico was different. New Mexico was a desert, and it didn't necessarily have the land that these newcomers coveted, but it also had a thriving Mexican culture that was unique and had been in place probably longer than anywhere else in the Southwest. Remember, 1598 is when, the first Mexican colonists came to New Mexico, a generation before the Pilgrims even landed at Plymouth Rock. So the roots in New Mexico are deeper, the culture in some ways more enduring, and it made for a unique history because whereas the cultures in California and Texas were decimated, in New Mexico they were able to thrive. People became educated. They had thriving businesses, and that's why we see such a strong Latino culture in New Mexico today.
And so you introduce us throughout the series to so many great historical characters. I wonder if you've got a favorite.
Oh boy, I don't know where to start. I guess one story that I didn't know about that I think is really important is, since we're talking about the Southwest here, there was a guy from Texas, a guy named Macario Garcia. Okay, he was a Mexican national, not an American citizen. And when World War II broke out, he was a cotton picker, a field worker, and he volunteered to join the army. And he went and was sent to Europe, and after Normandy had happened, and he was part of the U.S. military that was now going into the heartland of Germany.
And we're talking about a Mexican citizen
A
here.
Mexican national who fought for America. And as they hit the German border, they hit this area called the Hurtgen Forest. Very dense, forested region. And the U.S. military was bogged down, and every time they tried to go in, they were just completely slaughtered by German machine gun fire. And in fact, it was a terribly bloody campaign. Macario right away gets hit in the shoulder, falls to the ground, and begins to work his way around the German lines and finds the machine gun nest that was holding back the Americans. He kills all of the Germans in there single-handedly while being wounded, and then is heading back to his company when he sees another machine gun nest is again slaughtering Americans. Now being shot once in the shoulder, he goes back again behind enemy lines, engages with the German soldier, gets shot in the foot, kills the soldier, goes to the machine gun nest, throws in a grenade, misses, throws another grenade, hits it, kills all of the Germans in the machine gun nest, comes back down, and the American advance is able to continue into the heartland of Germany, saving countless American lives, and Macario collapses. The guy's almost dead. Word of his exploits go up the line, and within short order he is awarded the Medal of Honor from President Truman in Washington, D.C., the first Mexican national fighting in the U.S. military to win, be awarded that honor. He comes back to Texas. He is a rock star. I mean, he's the guy who got the big one, okay? And he's speaking at all these events. There are parades for him. He's the toast of the town. And so after one event that was sponsored by LULAC in Houston, he comes out and he took the bus home. He lived near Sugar Land, Texas. Gets off the bus, goes into a local diner, and they refuse to serve him. No Mexicans allowed. And that refusal, which was common back then, became the first salvo in the fight for civil rights and the desegregation of public facilities in the immediate years following the war, because people were so outraged that somebody who had earned this honor could be treated like that in a country for which he had sacrificed so much.
Now, I don't remember him from my history books, but is he in fact talked about nowadays as part of the public education system, this figure, say, in Texas? Or?
Hardly at all. Yeah. You would be hard-pressed to find the name of Macario Garcia in any history book in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California. It's as though he never existed. It's as though he had never made those sacrifices. And the shame is that during World War II, 500,000 Latinos volunteered and fought in that war. They were on the Bataan Death March. They stormed the beaches of Normandy. They were at Saipan. They fought against Rommel in North Africa. They liberated concentration camps. And yet, that's been omitted from our history. In fact, Mexican Americans were awarded more medals of honor during World War II than any ethnic group in the country. And I think Americans need to know that. They need to know that. It's important. not only for Mexican Americans, but for all Americans, because that is our common legacy. After all, Latino history is American history.
So you sound very passionate about the subject, right? And you're very well acquainted with the characters that you introduce in the series. So, tell me about your experience coming up, doing the research, and putting all this together and deciding what you would present. Did any of it surprise you? Did you learn anything yourself? I mean, you've done other documentaries with unrelated topics.
Yeah, I think the story of making this series is the story of one surprise after another. And once you think your mind has been blown, you come across something that's even more extraordinary. When I sat down and began researching the 2 films that I produced with my partner Dan McCabe, one of the first things I did is I did a Google search. And I Googled civil rights timeline, okay? Because I was doing a film on, the post-World War II, the beginning of the civil rights era going through the 60s and 70s. So if you Google this, you'll come up with dozens of hits. So I pressed the first one. They have their 1948 Truman desegregates the military. Remember, the military was segregated, right? And then you'll see Brown v. Board of Education that desegregated public schools. You'll see the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks and Dr. King. You will see the murder of Emmett Till. You'll see the Birmingham bombings. You'll see the march from Selma to Montgomery. You will see Cheney, Schwerner, Goodman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what you don't see, and what I was shocked, was that you didn't see one Latino name. You don't see the name of Cesar Chavez. You don't see Dolores Huerta. You don't see Hector P. Garcia. You don't see Jose Angel Gutierrez. You don't see Willie Velasquez. And it is as though we were bystanders of history, as though we never participated, as though history just passed us by and we were, just, watching everything happen. And so I think for me, what this series really means is it's an opportunity to write ourselves back into history, because we were there. We did help shape this country. We fought for civil rights. We were on the front lines. We fought against totalitarianism in World War II. And we stood up for democracy at home and equality in ways that have fundamentally made this country a better place. This country is a better place because of the presence of Latinos, because we fought, we struggled, we bled, in some cases we died, to try to make sure that this country would be true to its highest ideals and most noble aspirations. And Latinos did that. And we all need to understand that and reflect upon it, with a kind of sober consciousness.
So you've been going around talking about this series and promoting it. I wonder, so far 2 of the episodes have aired. I wonder if you're already starting to see a reaction, and what that reaction has been so far.
Oh, I think it's been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, I think it's a beautiful thing. I think people really recognize, they're surprised at what they see. I think it's an enjoyable series to watch. It's the kind of thing where, hey, it's not a boring documentary. You buckle your seatbelt, you're going to be in for a ride. You're going to see things that are shocking. You're going to see things that are disturbing. But you're also going to see things that make you proud, And I think in the end, a series like this has a very healing effect, because at the end of the day, it says that we're all Americans. We have common values and a common vision for this country, and we hold liberty and freedom dear to our hearts, like all Americans. And so I think this series will be something very positive for the country.
Well, tell us, where are your speaking engagements to talk about this particular documentary series?
Oh my gosh, I started in the beginning of September. And through Thanksgiving, I'm speaking at over 50 colleges and universities. It's almost a university, a college, a city every day. So I'm in Lubbock, in El Paso, in Las Cruces. I'm down in the Valley in McAllen, in Brownsville, in Houston, in Dallas, in Austin. I'm over in Pueblo, Colorado, in Phoenix. So I have 50 screenings in the fall, and then in the spring, that's just sort of Texas and this area. In the spring, I go to California, and I hope to have another 50 screenings there talking about this history.
Okay. And I wonder, how does it compare to other projects that you've done? Because you've done lots, and a lot of them had won awards and have been very well received.
Well, I think every film is unique and it's special, but I think this one's the one that takes the cake, because it's not simply a regional story. It's something that speaks to the very heart of what it means to be American, and it's something that talks about really the national soul. And I don't think we cut any corners in talking about very difficult issues like race, belonging, immigration, patriotism. Sometimes these are difficult things to talk about, but we need to engage. And I think this series does it in a way that will be very fruitful. So to me, this is the pinnacle of my career so far. I think I'm so excited.
Oh, well, congratulations on that. That's a big accomplishment to have reached that point, right, where you could say this is my...
Well, it's not just an accomplishment for the filmmakers, but really I think one thing that we have to recognize, remember I said about 74 years to have a series like this on television, and it was PBS that went forward, took the chance, put the money in place, and had the vision to create a series like this. It wasn't any other broadcaster. It was public television. And I think public television needs to take a bow and be proud of what it does. It's the best thing on television.
Well, let's talk about Latinos in America today. The Pew Hispanic Center says we make up 17% of the population. We're among one of the fastest ethnic groups in the country. And I wonder if you can talk about your experience with the Latino influence in things like politics, culture, and consumerism.
Right. Well, here's the thing. We know the demographics, right? By 2050, if the demographers are correct, we will be a minority-majority country. We will begin to shift so that there is no single ethnic group that represents a majority of the people. And by the end of this century, we may very well be a Latino country in some regard. So, we have a common interest. We need to really buckle down and figure out how are we going to work together in common cause? How are we going to forge a common vision of the future? And I think we're seeing it around us every day. In the food we eat, the music we listen to today, there are more Latinos elected to political office than there ever have been in the history of the Republic.
But yet the voting rate is far below what it could be, right? In 2010, it was like 10% of the total, which was a record, right? But it was still below what the number of eligible voters are.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems we have is that we're beginning to put barriers to participation in the democratic process, right?
Can you be specific?
Yeah, voter IDs, become very problematic. If you have to get a voter ID and you're elderly or you don't have access to a car and you live in a rural setting and there may not even be a place in your county to get an ID, it becomes a barrier, And so people become disenfranchised and left out of that process. And honestly, it's un-American. In order for our country to thrive and be robust in the 21st century, we need participation. We need to encourage people, and we need to find ways to get people engaged in the democratic process, not try to find ways to exclude people. And that's going to be one of the challenges moving forward.
Well, do you see any historical parallels from the Latino past and some of the things that you present in the documentary to the Latino present, right? Are there things, is history repeating itself in any way as far as you can see?
Yeah, I can give you two examples. One example is that during the 1930s, about 500,000 people were deported out of the country, right? And about half of those, 250,000 who were deported, were US citizens, right? Totally shocking.
How did that happen?
Well, if you're a Mexican national who's in the country and you have kids who are US citizens, then what ends up happening? You get the whole family deported. But also during the 1930s, people were rounded up, and if they didn't have proof of US citizenship on them in that moment, they were sent to Mexico. And there are many, many, many stories, and there's been a lot of scholarship done on this. It's a black mark on American history, really tragic. And today, we have had a lot of deportations as well. And sometimes when people get deported, they may have a spouse who's an American citizen, and they may have American citizen children. And so in essence, what happens is families get broken apart. And when families get broken apart, you have families who are struggling in poverty, and you end up creating a generation of people who are not really going to have access to the American dream. You have communities who are now broken. And so when we make these broad policies about papers and deporting illegals, you know, it's very complicated, and I think we have to think about it on a more nuanced level, and not simply in sound bites. And it can be very devastating. The other example I want to give you is during the 1970s and 1980s, Willie Velasquez, who's from this part of the country, from Texas, he started the largest Latino voter registration campaign in American history.
Even up to now? Comparatively? Or up
that
to that
I don't
point?
know. Up to that point,
that
I know
point.
for sure. Including now, I don't really know. But up to that point, okay? He brought millions of Americans to the polls who were previously disenfranchised and were not registered and were not engaged. Now, what happened, though, was he would go into a town, okay? And he would get everybody registered, and they would all vote for their candidates, say a Mexican American running for city council. And even though, say, 70% of the population was Mexican American, the Mexican American candidate would still lose. And that happened in city and town after town after town after town. They still lost even though they were all registered. And what they found out was happening was that the congressional districts were divided up in a way that if there was a Chicano community, one congressional district took part of the community, another congressional district took another part, another congressional district another part, and another congressional district another part, so that the community was divided, and Mexican Americans could never be elected to political office. So what Willie Velasquez did is he sued. 86 voting rights lawsuits. They never lost a case. And it got to the point where he would just threaten to sue and they would redistrict. Okay? Now today, there was recently a Supreme Court decision to scale back the Voting Rights Act, where states that had a history of voting rights abuses no longer need to get federal approval when they make changes in the voting laws. And so we may very well see things like gerrymandering, of congressional districts. In fact, I think we're beginning to see that, but it'll take time to find out. But it's a danger. We've already been there, and the hope is that we can, move forward with a more equitable, just, and fair system.
Well, I wonder then, we do talk, obviously we're talking about the history of Latino Americans in the United States, and I wonder then, but we're obviously not the only ethnicity contained within the country, and I wonder if you have looked to see if other ethnicities, you say, are represented in such a way historically, or not, right?
Oh, totally, like marginalized in a very similar way.
Like, is there a parallel? Is there a historical documentary that parallels the histories of other ethnicities in this country?
Yeah, I think so. When the Irish first came to the United States, they were seen as not being white, and they were treated pretty poorly. I think we can recall that in many places in New England there were signs that say "No Irish need apply." Right? Same with the Germans when they came in. When people came through Ellis Island, they experienced a lot of discrimination, So it's just part of the American legacy. If you look, for instance, I live in New York, right? What do we have in New York? We have Chinatown. Well, Chinatown didn't come about because Chinese all desired to live in one place. Some may have, but there were laws that prohibited where people could and couldn't reside. There was the Chinese, Exclusion Act. So it's.
But I wonder if these histories are also documented with the same nuance and detail that you have just produced in this series.
Right. Well, when those ethnic studies departments were established in the late 60s, early 70s. Asian American studies departments were established, and within ethnic studies there were departments and scholars who began to excavate Asian American history, who began to excavate and explore Native American history. So our understanding of the past from the 1970s to now has really become much more nuanced, sophisticated, more complete, and more inclusive, and that's good for everybody.
Okay. Well, and what do you see in terms of today, the history that Latino Americans are creating today? What do you think we'll be talking about a few generations from now about this particular point in time?
Oh, I think what we will be talking about is we will be talking about how Latinos really became part of the American mainstream in a way that is positive and forward-leaning. We have more and more Latinos who are climbing, the rungs of business and industry, and I think we're going to see not assimilation, right? Assimilation, one thing into another, which was kind of the 20th century model. But I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a kind of bi-similation, where Anglo-American becomes a little more Latinized, and where Latino America becomes more anglicized, and where we all learn from each other and steal and borrow from each other, and it will affect our language, it will affect our customs, it will affect the food we eat, the music we listen to. It will affect everything about our families, from interracial marriage to how we run the workplace.
Well, it's already doing that, right? Not just the Latino culture, but so many other cultures as well.
Exactly. When I was growing up, I had never heard of sushi, right? And now it's all over the place. And it's great. I love it. And so this is, a beautiful flowering of multicultural America, and it's exciting, and it's dynamic, and it's entrepreneurial, And it's new ideas mixing with with each other in order to create, something new and different. And it's fast moving, so you need to be engaged. And it's basically exciting, and it's a renewal of America, I think.
Cool. All right. So how about we take some questions from the audience?
Sure.
All right. So I think we've got maybe some. No. Here we go.
John Valadez, how you doing?
Hey.
My name's Jesse Forte. And one of my questions, as far as your video, if you had 3 facts that you wanted the people to understand from the video, what would they be? And as far as your background, where did you come from? What interests you? And what really made you design this video? What are your true, natural feelings about it?
Okay, 3 things that I would want people to take away. Is that more or less the first part of the question? I guess the first thing is that Latinos are not foreigners, right? We've been here a long time. We were here since the beginning and before the beginning, right? We're not foreigners. We're American, and we want the same thing that all Americans want, which is to have a good family life, to have a decent job, and to lead a fulfilled, imaginative life, which is what everybody else wants. And as we go into the 21st century, there are going to be changes and there are going to be bumps in the road, but we should remember that we're all on the same team here. We're all have the country's interests at heart, and we really do. About me personally, I grew up in Seattle, Washington. My parents are from Eastern Washington, from the Yakima Valley, and I come from a family of field workers. The Yakima Valley in Eastern Washington is an agricultural region, and so there are hops and there are peaches and apples and apricots. And so my family, was engaged in field work. And fortunately, I didn't do that, and I was able to go to college. I did work one day. I went and picked strawberries, and it was so hard. My back was killing me. I didn't even go back to get my paycheck. That's how wimpy I am. So it's those people who pick our food. We need to be grateful to them and show them some respect, because that's a difficult road,
Well, good evening, Mr. Valadez. My name is Ken Miyagashima, Mayor of the City of Las Cruces. I'd like to welcome you here to the city.
Wow, thank you.
You've been able to do something very few people can, and that's keep my attention for more than 10 minutes. So I find you very fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to this documentary. Although I have to say, I did grow up eating sushi and enchiladas at the same time. I'm half, my dad's Japanese American, my mom's Mexican American. So, growing up, I heard a lot of the struggles that Asian Americans went through, but not too much from Mexican Americans. So I'm glad to see this documentary, because I'd hear a few things from my mom, and I'm really looking forward to this. And I think it's very important that our children today see what our parents or great-grandparents went through, and they paved the trail for them to be able to have the great life that they have here in the United States. So I want to thank you for that and just welcome you here to the city of Las Cruces.
Thank you. I have a story that I think is maybe apropos. It's a story that's told in the World War II film. Once upon a time, there was a pretty pugnacious Mexican American who was growing up in East LA named Guy Gabaldon, or Gabaldon, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And he grew up in East LA, was always getting in fights. And but he, at some point, he befriended a Japanese American family that lived in his neighborhood, and they basically became his peer group and kind of, in a way, sort of raised him, and they taught him a lot about Japanese culture and some of the Japanese language. And he was basically heartbroken when World War II started and there was the attack on Pearl Harbor, and his adopted family was taken to a concentration camp. And Shortly after that, he joined the Marines and told them, listen, do you have anybody who speaks Japanese? Because I do, and I could be an interpreter. So they took him, and he was part of the invasion force on Saipan. And I don't know if you know anything about the military history, but Saipan is within striking distance with airplanes to the Japanese homeland. So it was a critical juncture in the war. If the Allies could take Saipan, then basically that was the end game. And when they landed, Guy went and against orders, went behind enemy lines alone and came back and had captured 4 Japanese soldiers. And he brought them back, and his commanding officer berated him and said, what are you doing? This is, you're going to get yourself killed. And he said, don't do that again. And, Guy said, yes, sir. Next evening, he loaded up his pockets with ammunition, went behind enemy lines, came back with 5 or 6 more Japanese prisoners that he had captured. And finally, his commanding officer said, okay, fine, let the little jerk do his thing. He's probably going to end up getting himself killed. Well, Guy Gabaldon went, and during the Saipan campaign, he was missing for a couple of days, and some scouts, Marines, were like looking through their binoculars, and they see all these Japanese soldiers on this ridge, and there's this Marine walking back and forth, and they're like, what the hell's going on? And so finally they sent some Marines, and Guy is leading these Japanese soldiers to the American lines. In one day, Guy Gabaldon captured 800 Japanese soldiers. And by the end of the Saipan campaign, he had captured over 1,500, a feat that had never been equaled in American military history. And he did it, and he saved Japanese lives, and he saved American lives by convincing those Japanese soldiers to lay down their arms and that they would be treated with dignity if they would give up. Wow. And he was able to do that because of his adopted family. And he was able to do that because he had a great affinity and love for Japanese people because they had taken him in when he was in a time of need.
Wow, thank you. Well, thank you for that story. Thank you.
Hi. Tough to follow the mayor, but I'll do my best. What if any, is there an obligation for Latino youth around the country to ensure that they are part of the next chapter of American culture, of American history? What is the obligation of the youth to not get passed by the way they have been in the past?
Yeah. I think there's an obligation for all youth to participate and to reach across racial and ethnic lines and to get to know each other. It's not just Latinos, it's that we're all in this boat together. And it's either we swim together or we're gonna sink together. We need one another. We are, after all, brothers and sisters in this country. And so, yeah, Latinos, there is an obligation that comes with citizenship that says you need to participate. You need to take a position because the country does not become a better place, a more just place, a more equitable place, does not become more free, unless people make a decision to push the country in that direction. And we all have to participate. We all have to have our ideas clash in the free marketplace of ideas for that conversation to move forward. And I guarantee you that if people who have an open mind, who love freedom, who want to span divides of difference, who want to build a better country, who believe in justice and equality, if those people do not speak up and make their voices heard and take a position and put themselves on the line, I guarantee you that the greedy, the small-minded, the petty, the ignorant, the bigoted, the racist, they surely will.
Good. Okay, all right. So let's go back to talking about the documentary and your experience putting it together. I'm curious what it was like to track down some of the families, some of the people you interviewed, like some of the ancestors, right, that you profile in here. Was it difficult to find them, and what was their reaction when you came up to them and say, "Hey, we want to talk about your relative so and so that did this historical thing, right, that we want to document"?
Yeah, well, I can talk about, the show I did on World War II. The World War II generation is disappearing before our very eyes. I mean, they're dying every day. And I think there was a tremendous amount of pressure, like a race against time, to try to get people before they were no longer with us and try to rescue that history. We were able to find a couple of guys who were Pachucos in LA and were there during the Zoot Suit riots. There aren't very many of those people left.
Did they still have some of their Zoot Suits in the closet, I wonder?
Well, more like walkers.
Yeah.
But there were those, and then we also found a woman who, you've heard of Rosie the Riveter, right? Women working in the defense industries in the 1940s. Well, we found a woman who became our Rosita the Riveter, because Mexican Americans were there too, and played a meaningful role in the defense industries at home. And for Mexican Americans, we didn't look at Rosie the Riveter. It wasn't Rosie the Riveter to us. It was Rosita the Riveter to us.
What sorts of works did Rosita do?
Oh, worked on airplanes, airplane manufacturing. Had to get inside the inside the fuselage and make sure everything was clean, get inside the gas tank, crawl inside it and scrub it, and just covered in filth. But it's an important job, because if you are flying in combat and that plane isn't built correctly, you're going to have a dead pilot and some dead crew members.
So we got another question from the audience. Yeah. Let's hear it.
John, thank you for making New Mexico State University and KRWG's Fronteras part of your tour. Can you talk a little bit about both the technical and financial challenges of putting together a 6-hour documentary?
Well, financial challenges are huge. I mean, it costs a lot of money to make PBS programming, in part because, we want to get it right. It has to be thoughtful. It has to be nuanced. We need to talk to a lot of people. And it can't be something where we're trying to push one particular perspective, or we're invested in one ideology or point of view. We really have to look at it in a way that's mature and balanced and fair-minded. And that takes time and it takes resources. So it's enormously difficult. The technical challenges, fortunately we were working with WETA in Washington, and we had an executive producer and a senior producer who are extraordinarily skilled at their jobs. And so it was a struggle, but and there were a lot of disagreements. Right? History is a clash of ideas. And there were many arguments in the edit room. But we all knew at the end of the day that we were working for a common cause. And so, so we found ways of compromising and making room for one another and coming out with a product that we could all feel very proud of.
Very well, very well.
Yeah.
We'll take another question from the audience.
Hi, I'm very interested in your subject matter. A lot of Latinos go their entire lives, military careers, not getting the proper recognition, not necessarily from their higher ups, but from the media in general. What was the spark that made you want to cover that? That made you want to kind of get deeper into that and see the real story going on?
Well, yeah, one thing that wasn't really aware of, and I think it's pretty important. Before this series, I did a film called The Longoria Affair, which was about the birth of the Mexican-American civil rights movement after World War II. But what I learned from making that film, and I think really applied to this series, was remember that when GIs came back from the war, they expected that after, facing down Nazis, right, and Japanese stormtroopers, that they would be treated the same as other Americans, that they had earned their citizenship. Not just that they were citizens, which they were, but that they had earned it, in blood. And they came back and they weren't treated very well. There were segregated schools. Interracial marriage was illegal in most states. There were segregated public facilities. There were covenants attached to mortgages for homes that limited where people could live based on their perceived racial or ethnic identity. And so it was really US military veterans after World War II who started the modern civil rights era. It was our veterans who fought battles overseas only to begin a new battle for civil rights at home. And so, in some ways, we owe our veterans, two debts of gratitude, not only for defending our country abroad, but for defending our liberty and notions of equality at home.
Another question?
Good evening, and thank you for being here. My name is Dolores Connor, born and raised in Las Cruces in the 50s, and born a Lucero, Mirabal Lucero, to be frank. And from that, I grew up in a community where my parents and my grandmother, who was born in 1880 in the Alamogordo area, who wanted us to be proud Americans, to embrace who we were, even though I was put in the closet in the first grade for speaking Spanish on the playground. But from that, how do we move forward? I picked onions. I've worked hard all my life. I've been a banker, an elected official, and moved my life forward. How do we teach our youth to quit repeating the past and embracing the culture without going into the negative, and picking up what the positive is of this century so that we can learn from the past but not repeat it?
Tough question. I shy away from words like positive and negative. To me, it's all history. I mean, it's just what happened, and I try not to attach a value to it. I think we need to be very frank about our history, but we also need to recognize that there are many ways to be American. There's not just one way. When we talk about, the Southerner from Georgia, it's one kind of American that's beautiful. Southern culture is great. Or we talk about, the Texan from Fort Worth, another kind of American, person. Or we talk about the Italian from Brooklyn, or the Jew from Long Island, or the New England Yankee from Boston. And they're all American, but in different ways. And Latinos are American in their own way too. And I think we just need to understand that, and we need to accept our differences, that there's not one mold. Latinos don't have to fit into somebody else's idea of what it means to be American. If we believe in freedom, if we believe in liberty, then we believe in a person's right to define themselves and their Americanness in their own way. And for me, that's one of the best things that this country has to offer is that freedom.
All right, well, we'll take one last question from the audience.
Okay.
Here we go.
Hi, I just want to let you know that you've really opened my eyes to the whole Hispanic and Latino culture. Like, I'm not from the United States. I'm from Vancouver, Canada, so I'm kind of close to where you're from. But there we have little to none Hispanic influence or like any population. Like, I maybe knew 2 people that were Hispanic that I went to high school with. So moving from all the way down to New Mexico and being in Las Cruces, where the Hispanic and Latino influence is so huge, and there's a lot of Hispanic population here. I've never really embraced the culture like I should have, I feel. And so like when I hear you speak here, I'm like, oh, I really should learn about it. Like, I'm living here. And I really think that if with what you're doing with these documentaries, if you're trying to influence, just the national culture, I feel like you could influence, everywhere, like North America. And I'm really happy that I came here and I'm able to be, in front of you and hearing what you have to say. So, and I kind of want to know, do you have any other projects like that are on your mind that you would like to, fulfill or, attack?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. The first thing is I think it's important for all of us to be proud of who we are. Black, Asian, white, Native American, and don't ever apologize whatsoever, and don't back down from that. Far too often we've, as Latinos, have felt like outsiders, and we felt like, well, we had to anglicize ourselves in order to fit in. Well, we don't have to do that, because America is about being yourself. It's about freedom.
Well, thank you very much, John, for taking the time to come visit us, and we wish you good luck on your tour as you go around the country talking about this documentary. And so be sure to watch the 3rd episode of Latino Americans Tuesday at 7 p.m. This has been Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Monica Ortiz Uribe. Have a good night.